Welcome to NetFindz. Today we're going to take a look at a game which I think I can confidently say is one of the best designed and most fun games ever made, and also one of the best deals available in gaming. You may have never heard of it. If you have heard of it, you may have never actually tried to play it, and you might have even tried to play it but not known how. If any of those is you, stick around. We're going to talk about why Magic the Gathering is an amazing game, an amazing value, and a lot simpler to play than you might think. I'm also going to provide a breakdown of the rules of Magic, detailed enough to get a thorough grasp on how to play at a competitive level for beginners, so if you already know how great Magic is and you just want the rules breakdown, feel free to skip ahead. Also, as part of this video, I am going to be doing a small giveaway. I'm going to be giving away a Magic the Gathering Bloomburrow Starter Kit to one viewer. If you're interested in entering that, stick around to the end of the video for more details on how to do so. Also, take a look down in the description below. Now, for full disclosure, I am not in any way sponsored by Magic the Gathering or Wizards of the Coast or anything like that. I'm just really coming to appreciate how amazing this game is, and I want to share that with you guys. That said, some of the accessory type items that appear in today's video, such as my card storage boxes or card sleeves and little things like that, are items that I've been given for review purposes. But either way, whether it's something that I paid for out of pocket or got for review, I'm going to give you my unbiased and unfiltered opinion about it. And as always, I will put Amazon affiliate links for any items in today's video down in the description below, so that if you guys do want to pick up the same thing, you have a convenient way to do that. And if you do, it does help out to support the channel. In the background, you'll see some Magic the Gathering cards just for eye candy, but real quick, if you're wondering if Magic the Gathering is worth your time or why you should look into it at all, listen up. If you like games, be it video games, board games, card games, any kind of game really, you owe it to yourself to give this one a try for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's the world's first and longest running trading card game. Magic was originally released back in 1993, and it's definitely one of, if not the best card game out there, in part due to that long history of iteration and polishing it over time. It features an absolutely huge selection of different cards, 27,000 plus at the time of making this video, all of which feature some of the most beautiful artwork out there in gaming. Frankly, some of the best fantasy artwork out there from some of the best fantasy artists in general, some of the most interesting characters, lots of varied ways to play, and it's got you covered for exploring tons of the best and most compelling fantasy archetypes available. If smoothly casting spells as a powerful wizard, fighting as a ruthless barbarian alongside an army of forest creatures, playing as a soldier, sailor, alien invader, maybe a gang of mouse bandits, fairies, zombies, orcs, and the list goes on, or these days even characters pulled directly from popular culture like Fallout, Doctor Who, Lord of the Rings. If any of that appeals to you, just know, Magic the Gathering has all of that, and it accomplishes it all in a way which is repeatable without being trivial or monotonous, and without the awkwardness that something like live-action roleplay can have. It's a game of strategy and tactics which draws on your knowledge of battle interactions and skills in planning attacks. And at its core, it's also great as a learning tool for building upon concepts of cause and effect, basic mathematics, and reading comprehension. It does all of this while being truly fun and allowing you to let your creativity run wild with being able to construct your own deck and continue to battle as a new archetype which you haven't seen tried before. Oh, and by the way, if that wasn't enough, you can play it extremely cheaply or completely free, your choice. So, as far as my experience with Magic the Gathering, I first got my hands on some Magic the Gathering cards as a kid. I want to say this was probably somewhere around the year 2000. My mom bought some cards just out of impulse, I think, at a convenience store, and she gave them to me and my brother. We really didn't know anything about Magic at the time, so we took the cards home, unpackaged them, and we spent a lot of time looking at the different artwork on them and reading them, but at no point did we ever actually play the game. Now, back then we didn't have internet access at home. There probably wasn't a rule booklet included with the cards, and if there was, we definitely didn't have the attention span to read and understand it. We may have even had some preconceived notions that it would have been too difficult, and ultimately, like I said, we never got to play. Looking back now, that seems like a total shame. And sadly, this is probably how many people's first experience with Magic the Gathering goes. Unfortunately, the rules of Magic the Gathering just aren't common household knowledge like the rules of Monopoly or Uno, for example, but I think that should change. Magic the Gathering is, after all, fairly simple and a lot of fun. So in my first iteration of this video, this section was 10 minutes long and got into a lot of detail on the 3 different methods to play. But in the interest of time and attention span, I've decided to shorten it significantly and just give you a quick breakdown of the 3 different methods and some pros and cons for each. So to start with, the 3 methods we're going to cover are the game as a physical card game, the cross-platform multiplayer video game on PC, macOS, Android, and iPhone, which is called Magic Arena, and the computer-only game, only available on Windows, called Magic the Gathering Online. So first, let's talk about the physical card game. The pros for this method: it can be the most fun. If you play with your friends, you get a much more full experience, a lot of laughter, and more personal face-to-face interactions that you just can't get through a video game, and that makes this method feel much more memorable and exciting. It's also still a pretty good investment, as you can get started pretty cheaply. You can get a starter kit like the one shown here that features Lord of the Rings characters for as little as like 20 bucks. There's all different types of starter kits, and they give you 2 full decks to play with, as well as redemption codes for those decks in Magic the Gathering Arena if you want to play both versions. Also, you can learn at your own pace. It's more casual. You and your friends can agree to modified rules as you see fit. You get physical items which retain their value. Return on investment in Magic the Gathering is pretty high compared to other games. It's generally quite easy to sell Magic cards, and there are many websites which will quote you for individual cards or for your entire collection. Every pack you buy is going to contain several cards worth under $1, probably a couple worth $1 to $5, and sometimes 1 or 2 cards worth like $10 to $100, depending on your luck. And collector booster packs are the best value for those interested in purchasing cards this way. You can make new friends at physical tournaments if you're competitive. That's another thing that is a benefit to the physical game. And you can also use it to take the place of other board games. It's much faster to play than something like Monopoly. A typical match in Magic the Gathering takes somewhere between 5 and 30 minutes. Now, the cons for the physical game: the main con is that it is much harder to get a match to be perfectly balanced, as it's way easier to misinterpret the rules when you manage it yourself versus a computer managing it for you. Still, it's relatively easy to clarify situations by just Googling it these days. Even Google's AI has a pretty good grasp on all the cards and the rules in Magic the Gathering, though it does misinform every once in a while. Next method of play, we're going to talk about Magic the Gathering Arena. The pros to Magic Arena: you can play it on any modern smartphone or on Windows or Mac computer, and you can play with people on a computer from your phone and vice versa. It's the best option if you don't have people to play with physically, and it's also the best option if you don't want to spend any money at all. Magic Arena is free to play, and it's one of the few free to play games which doesn't put a lot of pressure on you to spend money in the game. It's very easy to acquire new cards just by playing. So that would actually be my recommendation if you're playing Magic Arena. Probably don't spend your money on it. Just play, and you'll gain new cards just from playing pretty quickly and be able to make the kind of decks that you want. Another pro is you can see how every different card interaction is intended to resolve, and that takes all the guesswork out of the rules. Now on to the cons. The cons for Magic Arena: really there's just one big one, which is that you cannot cash out if you invest in it. Magic Arena cards can't be sold, only collected. So if you do put money into it, you're never going to get your money out of it. Last method that we're going to talk about is Magic the Gathering Online. Now, Magic the Gathering Online is a little bit of a dated game. It's much older, but it does have access to very high level of competition because it's older. This is where some of the oldest and most skilled players choose to play. Another big pro to Magic Online is that you can cash out your investment. It's actually the easiest place to sell cards, even compared to physical cards, as it's a totally automated process to sell cards in Magic Online. And it still has the benefit of taking care of all the rules for you so that you get to see how every card interaction is intended to take place. Now, the downsides to Magic Online is, again, it's older and much more dated of an experience. It's only available on Windows PC, and aside from the starting cards, you'll typically have to spend money to get more cards. Okay, so once you know which method you want to use to play Magic the Gathering, how do you actually play? I'm now going to take some time to break the rules down as simple as possible. A lot of people get bogged down in the details, but I'm going to give you as complete of an overview of the important nuances as possible while not going too crazy into the details. At the outset, I said that Magic the Gathering was simple, and at its core, that's true. Do be aware, though, it is a game which has been iterated on since 1993, and it does have a rule booklet 250 pages long, so there's a lot of detail and nuance there if you care to get into it. But in essence, it's a very simple game. Most of that nuance does not matter in casual play, and in the video game versions, it's taken care of for you. So let's start by getting familiar with the cards, the play area, and the basic outline of a match. So in Magic the Gathering, 2 to 4 players each begin the game with a set life total, typically 20 life, and battle each other utilizing a deck of cards, generally 60 cards, which we refer to as a library. You can either assemble your deck yourself, or you can purchase a pre-constructed deck from Wizards of the Coast or from someone else. Purchasing a pre-constructed deck would definitely be my recommendation for new players. This will give you the best experience while learning to play. Before the game starts, players toss a coin or another similar random chance method like rock, paper, scissors, or rolling dice, and whoever wins that decides who's going to take the first turn in the match. The game then begins, and both players draw a hand of 7 cards from their library. Players generally are given one opportunity to redraw a new hand of 7 cards if they don't like their starting hand before the game first turn officially starts. In Magic the Gathering, there are 7 main card types. Those are lands, creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, artifacts, sorceries, and instants. These get separated into 2 groups, lands and spells. Every card that's not a land is a spell. Lands provide mana, while spells cost mana and perform some action. After both players have their starting hand, the game then proceeds in turns, and each turn, the active player, which is the person whose turn it is, has the opportunity to draw a card from their library, play a single land, cast any number of spells from their hand which they have the mana to cast, and use creatures to attack the other player. A game is typically won by reducing your opponent's life to 0. However, you can also win if your opponent would draw a card with no more cards left in their library. Sometimes the game can also be won or lost through other conditions specified on individual cards. Those are known as win conditions. Next, let's break down the play area. It's usually arranged as follows. Opponents sit opposite each other, and in front of them, usually off to the upper left, is a method to track life totals. In the physical game, you can use a pen and paper, spin down counters, dice, or whatever else to track information like this. Next to that is the library, and next to that is the graveyard, which is an area designated to place cards when they're discarded or when they leave the battlefield. For example, when a creature dies or an instant or sorcery card is used. The battlefield is in the middle and has an area for land cards and another row for creatures and other permanents. In Magic, cards can either be permanents, which stick around on the battlefield after being played and continue to have actions, or they can be non-permanent. Now, permanents would be cards like lands, creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, and artifacts, and non-permanents would be cards like sorceries and instants. And the non-permanents are one-time use cards which are played. They have an immediate effect which resolves, and then the card goes to the graveyard. Occasionally, other zones also come into play, for example, Exile, but these are card dependent and they may not be needed every game. Next, let's take a closer look at the cards themselves. Cards in Magic either have some or all of the following parts. That would be a name, a mana cost, some artwork, a color, which is known by the type of mana in its costs or the type of mana that it grants in the case of lands, a type line, an expansion symbol, and a rarity, which you can know by the color of the expansion symbol. Common rarity is black and white, uncommon is silver, rare is yellow or gold, and mythic is an orange bronzish color. They also have a text box, sometimes flavor text within the text box, and flavor text is text that does not affect the game. It's just there to add to immersion and give you information about the lore of the card. And in the case of creature cards, they also have power and toughness ratings. In the case of planeswalkers, they have a number for their loyalty. Below that, cards usually have information about its number in a given expansion set and the artist who did the artwork. Let's take a closer look at lands. Lands generally look something like this. Again, they have a name, which could be unique, like Polluted Delta, or it could be more general, like Plains. They also have one of 5 colors, are colorless, or are multicolored. The colors in Magic the Gathering correspond to a type of mana and are as follows. Red mana is granted by mountains, white mana comes from plains, blue mana comes from islands, green mana comes from forests, and black mana comes from swamps. And every card is either one of those 5 colors, colorless, or multicolored, based either on its mana cost or the kind of mana it grants. A deck in Magic the Gathering usually consists of cards of 1 or 2 different colors, and sometimes some colorless cards as well. Due to the fact that lands generally only provide a certain color of mana, and spells usually require at least one specific color of mana. So limiting the number of different colors in a deck allows for ease of casting spells by ensuring that you have enough mana of the necessary types available. Though it is possible to build decks with 3 or more colors, and even all the colors, or only colorless cards for that matter. Now, another important thing to note is that in the case where a card has a unique name like Polluted Delta, you can only have 4 of such cards in a deck at a time. However, in the case of basic lands like Plains or Swamp, you can have as many of these in a deck as you wish. And this 4 of a given name rule applies not just to uniquely named lands, but it applies to all cards. Now let's take a look at spells, which look something like this. Just like lands, they also have a name, and as I said, with the exception of basic lands, all cards of a unique name are limited to 4 of a specific card in a deck. That applies to spells as well. They also have a type line, and an interesting thing to note here is that for permanents which have the legendary type, you can only have 1 such legendary of a given name on the battlefield at a given time, though you can still have up to 4 of the same card in your deck. Spells also have a mana cost and color denoted by the types of mana used to cast it. This is how many lands of each type you have to tap in order to cast the spell. To tap a card in Magic the Gathering is to turn it sideways. This just allows other players to know that the card has been used for the current turn and cannot be activated again until next turn. Mana cost, which is displayed in the top right corner of the card, generally contains some combination of X, a circled number, or colored symbols representing specific colors of mana needed to be cast. X represents a variable amount of mana which the caster can choose how much to pay in order to affect the strength of the spell when it's cast. The circled number represents an amount of mana of an unspecified color, and any color of mana will suffice to fill this amount. The colored symbols each represent 1 mana of the given color. So a card which had a mana cost that looks like Jade Light Spelunker here, who has an X followed by a single green circle, could be cast with an amount of mana of your choosing of any color to satisfy the X requirement, and 1 green mana. So for example, if you wanted to cast Jade Light Spelunker and have its Explore ability activate only once, you could pay 1 white mana or any other color, plus 1 green mana for a total of 2 mana. But if you wanted its ability to activate twice, you could pay 2 white mana or any other color, and 1 green mana for 3 mana total. On the other hand, a card like Another Round, shown here, which has 2 X's followed by a circled number 2 and a single white mana, would cost a minimum of 2 mana of any color of your choosing to satisfy the X requirement, since there are 2 X's, and an additional 2 mana of any color to satisfy the circled 2, and a single white mana for a minimum of 5 total. But if you wanted its ability to activate 2 extra times instead of just 1 extra time, you'd have to pay 2 unspecified mana twice for 4 total for the X requirement, plus an additional 2 for the circled 2 and a single white mana. As we just saw, spells also have a text box, which contains information about abilities that card has and what it can do. It's good to know that the text on a card always takes precedence over the established rules of the game. For example, if a card were to state that when it's played you win the game, you would win the game immediately after playing the card regardless of whatever other rules might be taking place, except in one instance, which is that in the case there is another card that says you can't win the game. In that case, the card which says can't would take precedence over a card which says you can do something, and this is always the case. The word can't on a card always takes precedence over the word can. Next, let's take a closer look at each of the different types of spells. Let's see how they would be used to affect combat in a battle and get a better understanding of the breakdown of a turn. So in this Magic Arena match, we can see that my opponent will go first, randomly chosen by the computer, and I have a starting hand of 4 lands, one of which is a tap land, meaning it enters the battlefield tapped, 2 of which are fetch lands, meaning they search my library for another land, then put it out onto the battlefield tapped. I've also got 1 sorcery card, which is a non-permanent that has the ability to exile other non-land permanents and create me a rabbit token creature. Token creatures are those which get created from the effects of other spells rather than being cast on their own card. I also have 1 Mossborn Hydra creature spell and a Planeswalker. I decide to keep my hand rather than redrawing. Note that in this version of the game, had I chosen to redraw, I would start with 6 cards instead of 7. Here you can see that my opponent decided to redraw his hand and gave up a card to do so. Turns in Magic the Gathering are broken up into phases. There are 5 phases per turn, and the phases happen every turn even if nothing takes place during a phase. In practical, casual play, phases are a transparent process that more or less goes unnoticed, but it's important to know that they are happening in the background. In Magic the Gathering Arena, because the game is managed by a computer, phases are a bit more visible. You can see a representation of the phases here in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Also important to know is that at the end of a turn, by default, you cannot have more than 7 cards in your hand. If you do, you'll have to discard cards to your graveyard until you have a total of 7. The phases of a turn are beginning phase, during which players untap all permanents and draw a card. The first main phase, during which cards can be played, including playing your land and casting spells. The combat phase, during which creatures attack and defend. The second main phase, which is an extra opportunity to cast spells with leftover mana or play a land if not done so in the first main phase. And the ending phase, which is just like it sounds, the turn ends and passes to the next player. This match, my opponent goes first and plays his first card, which is a tap land that deals me 1 damage when it enters. Because he went first in this game, he does not draw a card during his beginning phase. Since he has no available mana, after playing his first land and no other cards capable of being played, his turn quickly and transparently passes through the rest of the phases, ends, and I begin my turn. Since I went second, I draw a card at the end of my beginning phase. Each turn after the first, the active player will do the same. And then I enter my first main phase, where I too play a tap land, except mine heals me for 1 life when it enters. I have no other available actions that I can take after that, and my turn ends and passes to my opponent. And the next couple of turns go a bit like this. We draw cards, and you can see that tapped permanents like lands untap. Then in our main phase, we play 1 land and pass to the next player as we build up mana to cast spells. Since each player can play 1 land per turn, this allows players to have access to more mana each turn gradually, and for more powerful spells to be cast as the game progresses. When you use a land as mana to cast a spell, you tap it. On my 3rd turn, I'll cast the first creature, which is Mossborn Hydra. Creature spell cards are similar to other cards we've seen so far. Notably, they have a name, a mana cost. In the case of Mossborn Hydra, 2 generic mana, any color or colorless will do, and 1 green mana. A type, Mossborn Hydra is an elemental Hydra. From his expansion symbol in gold, you can tell he is a rare creature. Creatures also have a text box that tells you about their abilities, and sometimes added flavor text, which does not affect combat. In the case of Mossborn Hydra, he does not have flavor text. Creature cards also have a number, which looks a bit like a fraction down in the bottom right. This is the creature's power, which is the left number, and that is the amount of damage it can deal when in combat, and toughness, which is the right number, which is the amount of damage it can absorb before dying and being sent to the graveyard. In the case of Mossborn Hydra, we can see he has 0 power and 0 toughness. But the text on the card states, this creature enters with a 1/1 counter on it. A counter is something that we place onto a permanent that alters its abilities, similar to a buff in other games. In this case, a 1/1 counter grants the creature an additional 1 power and 1 toughness, and is represented here by a blue circle with the number 1 on it. In the physical card game, players use dice, paper and pen, dry erase boards, sheets, or really anything else they find handy to represent counters. So Mossborn Hydra enters the battlefield as a 1/1. When you first cast a creature spell, they come into play with Summoning Sickness, represented here by a black effect swirling over the creature, which prevents them from attacking or activating tap abilities until the 2nd turn they're on the battlefield, but still allows them to block. Beware, however, that tapped creatures cannot block. Since my Mossborn Hydra cannot attack this turn, my turn ends and my opponent draws a card, plays a land, and answers by casting his own creature spell, Marauding Blight Priest. A common, 3 power, 2 toughness, vampire, cleric, for 2 generic mana and 1 black mana, which states, whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. After the main phase comes the attack phase, during which you can allocate any number of creatures who do not have Summoning Sickness and are not already tapped to attack the other player. A player declares attackers by selecting creatures to attack, declaring who they will attack. Mind you, they can only attack players or planeswalkers directly. Creatures cannot target other creatures. And then tapping those creatures to indicate they've taken their action for the turn. The opposing player then gets an opportunity to declare blockers to defend their life points. The player blocking declares which creatures he wants to use to block which attacking creatures, and multiple creatures can be declared to block a single attacker, but the attacking player then gets to decide the order in which his attackers deal damage to the blocking creatures. After a player has finished attacking, they're given a last chance to cast spells using remaining mana, and then the next turn is passed to their opponent. In this case, his creature also comes with Summoning Sickness and cannot attack, so his turn ends and priority is passed back to me. I draw a card. I then play the new card I drew, which is Ajani, Caller of the Pride, who is a Planeswalker. So, taking a look at Planeswalkers, you can see they also have a name, a mana cost, art, a type line, a rarity symbol, mythic in the case of Ajani, Caller of the Pride, a text box, and a number in the bottom right. This time, that number is a single number. This number on Planeswalkers is called Loyalty, and a Planeswalker is a bit like having an additional player to help you out in combat. That's how I like to think of it. And loyalty is essentially like the Planeswalker's life. Also, instead of having mana to activate their abilities or tapping, Planeswalkers pay to activate one ability per turn, and they pay with their loyalty. Ajani's first ability allows him to put a 1/1 counter on a single creature and grants him one additional loyalty, where his next two abilities cost loyalty, but provide stronger benefits. When facing a player with a Planeswalker on the battlefield, you can choose when attacking to either target the player or target the Planeswalker's loyalty. And the defending player can allocate creatures to block the same as they would for their life points. Here we see when Ajani comes out, I'm able to immediately use him to give a 1/1 counter to my Mossborn Hydra, and his loyalty increases from 4 to 5. Planeswalkers are not subject to summoning sickness. They cannot attack, they can just activate their abilities and be attacked. Next, I play Evolving Wilds, a colorless land known as a fetch land, which allows me to tap and sacrifice it in order to search my library for a basic land, and put that card onto the battlefield tapped. When I first play it and it enters the battlefield, you can see something interesting happens, which is that our first triggered ability for a creature gets triggered. This is Landfall on Mossborn Hydra. Often abilities in Magic the Gathering have keywords like Landfall or Haste. These are just shorthand names for things that make it easier for players to understand what the card does at a glance without a lot of text. You don't have to worry about memorizing these keywords. In the physical card game, usually there is a little bit of text afterwards that says what the keyword does. If there's not, it's a good idea to just have a list of them printed out so that when you see a new one that you're not familiar with, you can look it up real quick and then you'll know what it does in the future. In the video game versions of this game, generally you can hover over a creature with a keyword and see a definition for the keyword. Keywords also function as buffs usually. In the case of Landfall, it means that this ability triggers when a land enters the battlefield under your control. In the case of Mossborn Hydra, its Landfall ability allows it to double the number of 1/1 counters on it, bringing its power and toughness from 2/2 to 4/4. One of the cool things about triggered abilities is that they happen whenever the trigger takes place. So in this case, the first trigger happens when Evolving Wild hits the battlefield. Because that card also allows it to tap and be sacrificed and place another basic land onto the battlefield, Mossborn Hydra's Landfall is activated twice, bringing it to 8/8. There are many combos like this you can create with triggered abilities in Magic the Gathering, and it's one of the more fun aspects to build around, being able to have different triggered abilities all work off of one another and trigger each other. As you play, you'll experiment with that and you'll find combinations that you like. I then attack my opponent's life points with Mossborn Hydra, and he chooses not to block, likely because his creature is 3/2 and blocking against Mossborn Hydra would kill it. When creatures fight each other during combat in Magic the Gathering, they deal damage to each other simultaneously. So in the case of an 8/8 creature fighting a 3/2 creature, the 8/8 would deal 8 damage to the other creature's 2 toughness, killing it, and at the same time the 3/2 creature would deal 3 damage to the other creature's 8 toughness, and Mossborn Hydra would survive in this case. Typically, it might still be a good idea to block in a scenario like this, as it would prevent you from taking 8 points of damage to your life, and perhaps the creature could be easily replaced. In this particular case, though, Mossborn Hydra has another ability written on it in its text box, and that one says Trample. Trample is shorthand for a buff that allows a creature to deal excess combat damage to a player's life points. So had my opponent blocked, his creature would still have died after taking 2 points of damage to his 2 toughness, and the remaining 6 points of damage that Mossborn Hydra could deal would still have hit his life, bringing him to 14 instead of 12, but without a creature for his next turn. You can see that after my turn ends, Mossborn Hydra is tapped That means both my life points and my Planeswalker's loyalty are exposed for this turn, as I have no creatures that can block. My opponent casts an enchantment which attaches to a creature and states, "Enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated," rendering Mossborn Hydra useless so long as it remains enchanted. He then follows that up by casting another creature, Deep Cavern Bat, who has flying and lifelink, and on entry allows him to exile a card from my hand until Deep Cavern Bat leaves the battlefield. My opponent chooses a card from my hand, and that card is sent to exile, where I am not able to access it. He then chooses to attack my Planeswalker's loyalty, bringing it from 5 to 2, and ends his turn. On my next turn, I play a land, and it's interesting to note that Mossborn Hydra's landfall ability still happens even though it's enchanted with a card that says, "Activated abilities can't be activated." And that's because in the case of landfall, it is a triggered ability, not an activated ability. I then choose to play Vivian Reed, a second Planeswalker, and I choose to use her second ability, which costs 3 of her starting loyalty but allows me to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. In this case, I destroy Petrify, giving me back full control over my Mossborn Hydra. I use a Johnny's ability to give it an additional 1/1 counter, bringing its total power to 17, and I attack my opponent's life points. He blocks the damage with 1/1 Deep Cavern Bat, but because of Mossborn Hydra's trample ability, he still takes 16 points of damage, bringing his life total below 0 and loses the match. Next, let's take a look at sorcery cards. Sorceries are spell cards which can be played during your main phases. They have the same parts as most other cards, like a name and mana cost, but unlike permanents, when you play a sorcery, you pay some amount of mana and the card has an effect which resolves generally right away, and the card immediately goes to your graveyard. They're a one and done sort of a deal. In this case, my opponent played Ariette's Lullaby for 2 mana during the first main phase of his turn. The spell targets my creature. This is not considered combat. Sorceries can target what they state they're able to target, in this case a tapped creature, my Healer's Hawk. It immediately destroys it, and my Healer's Hawk as well as Ariette's Lullaby both go to the graveyard. We stated previously that creatures cannot be targeted directly. This is a good opportunity to reiterate one of the most fundamental concepts in Magic the Gathering, which is that all rules for all cards follow first and foremost what is written on the card. Card text takes precedence over rules. So for example, even though the rule is creatures must wait 1 turn before attacking, if a card says it doesn't have to wait 1 turn to attack, it doesn't have to. If a card states it can target a creature directly, it can do so. To build on this concept, in more advanced cases, the word can't takes precedence over the word can. So for example, if a creature card says it can attack on the turn it's played, but the opponent's card says creatures cannot attack the first turn they are played, the creature would not be able to attack on its first turn in play. Instants are another type of card, very similar to sorceries, except instants can be played not only during your own turn's main phases, but also during your opponent's turn and whenever you gain priority. In Magic the Gathering, you gain priority during the start of most of your turn's phases, but you also gain it whenever your opponent wants to move to the next step of their turn, or when they try to resolve an action or ability. For example, in this match, I choose to play the instant card Make a Stand during my own turn's combat, but after my opponent declares blockers. Because he's already declared blockers and passes priority to allow combat to resolve, I'm able to play an instant to change the outcome of battle. In this case, my instant cards gives all my creatures +1 to power and indestructible until the end of turn. This allows my Mossborn Hydra to deal trample damage after fighting a creature with Death Touch that would otherwise have killed it, ending the game in my favor. Instant cards are a powerful way to catch your opponents by surprise and turn the tide of battle, and they introduce us to one of the most advanced concepts necessary to have a solid competitive grasp in Magic the Gathering, and that is the stack. Whenever some action like triggered abilities, the effects of instants and sorceries, etc., need to resolve, they get placed onto what is known as the stack. When something is put onto the stack, the opposing player gets an opportunity, again called priority, to use cards like Instants to change the outcome of whatever was about to resolve. Here we can see that I attempt to play the creature spell Grand Abolisher, who importantly has the effect, during your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. This would effectively prevent my opponent from using an instant during my turn. When I play the card, it gets placed onto the stack, and priority is passed to my opponent. In this case, my opponent is well prepared and immediately casts Werefox Bodyguard, a creature spell with the keyword Flash. Flash allows players to cast the card at instant speed. Essentially, this turns the creature into an instant. He's able to cast it during my turn. And Werefox Bodyguard also has, when this creature enters, exile up to one other target non-fox creature until it leaves the battlefield. So how do we know which takes place first? Does my Grand Abolisher prevent his Werefox Bodyguard from resolving and hitting the battlefield? Or will his Werefox Bodyguard hit the battlefield first and exile my Grand Abolisher? To answer this, all you need to know is that items get placed onto the stack immediately when triggered, and they resolve in reverse order to which they are placed. In this case, I play my Grand Abolisher first, and he goes onto the stack first. Werefox Bodyguard gets played second, and he goes onto the stack next. When the stack resolves, the last item, Werefox Bodyguard in this case, resolves first, so he hits the battlefield first, and when he does, his triggered ability to exile a target non-fox creature is immediately placed onto the stack on top of Grand Abolisher. And again, that is removed first, being the last item onto the stack. He exiles Effie, Fast Learner, who's already on the battlefield, and Grand Abolisher resolves last, preventing my opponent from casting any additional spells during my turns. But what happens if me and my opponent's triggered abilities trigger simultaneously? In cases such as these, the active player places items onto the stack first, followed by the non-active player. For example, here, me and my opponent both have triggered abilities that take place when a creature attacks. In his case, when a creature with flying attacks. In my case, whenever one or more creatures attack. When my creatures attack all at once during my turn, both abilities trigger simultaneously. Because I'm the active player, my ability goes onto the stack first. Because the opponent is the non-active player, his ability goes onto the stack last. But remember, the stack resolves in reverse order, so the last item onto the stack resolves first, allowing them to draw a card before I'm able to attack. So now I'd like to say congratulations, you've made it to the end of the video, and not only do you know the basics of Magic the Gathering, but you've got a grasp on some of the most advanced concepts needed to be competitive, like how abilities resolve onto the stack, which types of effects take precedence over each other, how to make use of Planeswalkers, which can be some of the most powerful cards in Magic, and so on. In the future, I may make another video to talk about deck building and discuss Magic the Gathering formats or sets. For now, suffice to say, when getting started in Magic the Gathering, don't be intimidated by complex topics like formats, rule sets, or deck building. At the end of the day, it's a card game, and it's all about how you want to play and enjoy it. But that's going to wrap up this video, guys. If you appreciated the content, feel free to leave me a like, write a comment, or subscribe to my channel. All of that's definitely appreciated. Remember, if you want to pick up any of the items shown in the video, check the links down in the description below, as that is also a great way to help support the channel as well. Also, if you stuck around this long and you're interested in entering the giveaway for the Bloomburrow Starter Kit, check the description below for a link to the NetFindz Facebook page, where there will be a post called the Official NetFindz March 2025 Sweepstakes. All you need to do to enter the sweepstakes is to comment on that post. You can comment whatever you want, but I'd love to hear your opinions on Magic the Gathering or what your favorite game is. The winner will be selected at random on the 30th of the month and contacted via Facebook to be informed they've won. See the full official rules also linked below for additional information, as well as any restrictions on entry. For example, you do need to be 18 years of age or older to enter and located within the 48 contiguous states of the United States of America. Other than that, have an awesome time playing Magic, and see you in the next video.